And so the sort of sad finding is that being able to harm members of other groups and to a lesser degree benefit our own group is something that raises our self-esteem. And on the one hand, that helps explain why it should be quite so ubiquitous a finding that we do engage in discrimination and engage and develop prejudice just based on group membership, even if those groups are not relevant. On the other hand, it makes us appreciate the challenges that we face when trying to avoid prejudice and discrimination. If it is even acting as a self-esteem boost, then we need to consider how we can get around that. And as we'll talk about on Monday, actually some of the interventions are based on finding other ways to boost self-esteem other than using discrimination. So minimal group theory and realistic conflict theory and social identity theory are cultural theories of prejudice. They focus on how these groups, regardless of content, sort of orbit around each other and develop into relationships and ultimately develop prejudice and stereotypes. And that was a good match for the early days of social psychology, when the emphasis was really on sociocultural approaches, looking at how groups interacted. They weren't that interested in the content of the groups. However, as there became a more cognitive perspective in psychology generally, and as the social cognitive approach became more prominent in social psychology as well, the study of prejudice shifted from these more sort of cultural, sociocultural ideas like realistic conflict or social identity to instead more cognitive approaches. And cognitive approaches were based on a particular understanding that, and the assertion of cognitive approaches was that prejudice is a matter of belief. How we feel is a product of what we believe. And so in this perspective, stereotypes are critical, so that it shares this with the stereotype threat theory. In a cognitive perspective, the stereotype, the beliefs are the most important in leading to prejudice and discrimination. And in particular, what the cognitive perspective is interested in is how we end up having beliefs about groups of people, how we develop stereotypes. And the argument that the cognitive perspective is going to make is that we develop and keep stereotype beliefs because of the way that our mind works. There are mental processes, biases, heuristics that tend to lead us to develop and maintain stereotypes. This is not to excuse stereotypes. Instead, it's a way of understanding why we seem to be so susceptible to developing stereotypes. And the reason they argue that we're so susceptible is that there are mental shortcuts. What we attend to, what we remember, those things lend themselves to the development of stereotypes. So I want to talk about several kinds of research that the cognitive perspective has identified in terms of, first of all, how stereotypes develop, what mental shortcuts and mental biases lead us to develop stereotypes in the first place. And then, once stereotypes are established, what mental processes and biases lead us to keep our stereotypes, even though we may be confronted with evidence against the stereotypes in our environment. So there are two primary approaches that are in this literature concerning what the cognitive processes are that lead to the development of stereotypes. And what you'll see is that in the model in this research is to understand how stereotypes about groups could develop in the absence of any actual evidence supporting that stereotype. And so what researchers are going to try to demonstrate is that even with no actual evidence supporting a stereotype, there are mental processes that can lead that stereotype to emerge. And so this is pretty powerful and important stuff if this is true. If they can show that stereotypes can emerge even without any evidence supporting a stereotype, that gives us an appreciation of the strength of the mental processes that might lead us to develop stereotype beliefs. The main research area that's been able to demonstrate that we can in fact develop stereotypes about groups even without any evidence bearing on the stereotype. It's work known as either illusory correlation or shared distinctiveness. It's known as illusory correlation research because the idea, as you'll see, is that we imagine a correlation between being a member of a particular group and having some negative qualities. So it's a correlation because we see some relationship between being in a group and having some attributes. We see a correlation, but it's an illusory correlation because the correlation does not exist in reality. There's actually zero relationship between being a member of that group and having these particular attributes. And we come to believe that the correlation exists even though there is not one. So the fact that we believe that there's a correlation, even though the correlation does not objectively exist, that's what tells us it's an illusory correlation. What was proposed by researchers, and what's also called shared distinctiveness, is that the way we come to have these fake correlations, the way we come to believe these illusory correlations is that when two things happen at around the same time that are both distinctive, they're both unusual, we come to believe that there's some necessary causal relationship between them, even if there's no actual evidence that they are related. So it's called shared distinctiveness because the idea is when two distinctive or unusual events happen around the same time, we come to believe, just automatically it seems, that they share some common pathway. We don't believe, oh, these two things sometimes happen together. Instead, we believe that these two unusual, distinctive things always happen together. So shared distinctiveness and illusory correlation are the same phenomenon because we imagine a relationship that doesn't exist between two distinctive things that happen together in time. So for example, if you're walking down the street and you see a 7-foot-tall woman carrying a rabbit, let's let the rabbit be alive, just to make it a less disturbing story. 7-foot-tall woman carrying a live rabbit. What the theory argues is not that you will think, wow, that is an extremely tall woman who happens to be carrying a rabbit. You won't even think, wow, that is one tall woman who happens to like rabbits. Instead, what you'll come to believe, even though this is not the product of conscious thinking, is, tall women must like rabbits. And so what you're going to see is these two unusual things. You're going to see a relationship between them. You're going to see a shared cause, even though you have no evidence